Close your eyes and get comfortable. Tonight, we are traveling to the winter of 1944, to a forest in the heart of Europe so dense and so dark that the trees block out the sky. A forest of ancient pine and frozen oak, stretching across the borders of Belgium and Luxembourg and Germany, in a region called the Ardennes. A place of narrow, winding roads and small stone villages, and valleys so steep and wooded that armies had considered it impassable for generations. It was December, the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Snow lay deep across the forest floor. The rivers were frozen. The roads were sheets of ice. The temperature dropped below zero and stayed there for days at a time. And into this frozen wilderness, Adolf Hitler sent the last great offensive force Germany had left. Tonight, we will tell the story of the Battle of the Bulge, the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought by the United States Army. A battle that began in darkness and surprise and cold, and ended in the snow-covered forests of Belgium with the back of the German war machine broken forever. There is no rush tonight. Let the story carry you. To understand the Battle of the Bulge, we have to understand where the war stood in the autumn of 1944. It had been 6 months since the Allied landings on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. 6 months since American and British and Canadian soldiers had fought their way up those sandy beaches under withering German fire and established a foothold on the European continent. In those 6 months, the Allied advance had been extraordinary. Paris had been liberated on August 25, 1944. The crowds that lined the Champs-Élysées as Allied troops marched through the city wept and cheered and threw flowers. France had been under German occupation for 4 years. The liberation felt like a resurrection. Belgium had been liberated. Luxembourg had been liberated. The Allied armies had pushed the Germans back across France and were now standing at the borders of Germany itself. The Rhine River, the great natural barrier that separated the Allied forces from the German heartland, was within reach. In the east, the Soviet Union had launched Operation Bagration in the summer of 1944, one of the most devastating military offensives in history. Soviet forces had destroyed an entire German army group and advanced hundreds of miles westward. The Red Army was now in Poland and pressing toward the German border from the east. Germany was being squeezed from both sides. In the west, General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force. American, British, Canadian, French, Polish, and other Allied troops, numbering in the millions. His generals were brilliant and aggressive. George S. Patton's Third Army had raced across France with astonishing speed. Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group held the northern flank. Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group held the center. The mood among the Allied High Command in the autumn of 1944 was cautiously optimistic. Some believed the war would be over by Christmas. Supply lines were stretched thin. The Allied advance had outrun its logistics, but the Germans seemed to be on the verge of collapse. The Allied line in the Ardennes region was held thinly. Eisenhower and his generals considered the Ardennes a quiet sector. The dense forest and difficult terrain made a major offensive through it seem unlikely. 2 inexperienced American divisions were stationed there to get their baptism of fire in what was expected to be a peaceful stretch of front. 2 exhausted divisions had been sent there to rest and recover. It was precisely this thinly held, quiet sector that Hitler had chosen for his last great gamble. Adolf Hitler, in the autumn of 1944, was not the same man who had launched the war in 1939. He was physically deteriorating. The assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944, when a bomb planted by German officers had exploded in his headquarters, had left him with a perforated eardrum, damaged right arm, and psychological wounds that never healed. He walked with a shuffle. His left hand trembled uncontrollably. He slept during the day and worked through the night in a pattern that had become increasingly detached from reality. But his mind was still working. And in the autumn of 1944, it fastened onto an idea. The Western Allies, he believed, were a coalition held together by convenience rather than conviction. Americans and British had different interests and different commanders with large and clashing egos. If Germany could deliver a sudden, catastrophic blow to the Allied armies in the West, if it could break through their lines, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and cut off the British and Canadian armies in the north from their American allies in the south, then the coalition might fracture. Britain might negotiate a separate peace. America might turn its attention to the Pacific. Germany would then be free to turn its full remaining strength against the Soviet Union in the East. It was a fantasy. Most of Hitler's generals knew it was a fantasy. They argued against it. They pointed out that Germany did not have the fuel to sustain a major armored offensive, that the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the skies, that the divisions being assembled for the attack were exhausted and under strength, that the element of surprise, the only real advantage Germany still possessed, would last only days before Allied air power and reserves overwhelmed the offensive. Hitler overruled every objection. He called the operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately misleading name suggesting a defensive operation to confuse Allied intelligence. He assembled 3 armies for the assault. The 6th SS Panzer Army under SS General Sepp Dietrich would strike in the north. It contained the most powerful German armored units remaining in the west, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, the Führer's own bodyguard division. The 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel would strike in the center, the most critical thrust aimed directly at the key road junction of Bastogne. The 7th Army, under General Erich Brandenberger, would protect the southern flank of the advance. In total, approximately 200,000 German soldiers and 600 tanks and assault guns were assembled in the forests east of the Ardennes in complete secrecy. Movements were made only at night. Radio silence was strictly maintained. Aircraft engines were used to mask the sound of tank engines moving into position. The Allies had almost no warning. Almost. American intelligence officers had noted unusual German radio traffic. A Belgian resistance fighter had reported strange sounds in the forest at night. A German prisoner had mentioned an offensive in passing during interrogation. None of these warnings were taken seriously enough. The attack was scheduled for dawn on December 16, 1944. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the German artillery opened fire. Nearly 2,000 guns fired simultaneously along an 85-mile front. The sound was heard miles away. The ground shook. American soldiers, sleeping in their foxholes and farmhouses and barns, were jolted awake by a roar that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For 90 minutes, the shells fell. Then the German infantry came out of the forest. The American units holding the Ardennes front were caught completely off guard. The 99th Infantry Division and the 106th Infantry Division, both relatively inexperienced, bore the initial brunt of the 6th SS Panzer Army's assault in the north. The 28th Infantry Division, exhausted and depleted from earlier fighting, faced the 5th Panzer Army in the center. In the chaos of the opening hours, communication broke down completely. Units lost contact with their headquarters. Commanders did not know where the attack was coming from or how large it was. Soldiers fought and died in isolated pockets without any clear picture of what was happening around them. In the north, the 6th SS Panzer Army made initial gains, but ran into fierce resistance from American units that refused to break. The town of Elsenborn Ridge became a critical anchor point. American artillery massed on the ridge and poured fire into the advancing German columns with devastating effect. The northern shoulder of what would become the Bulge held. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army, under the capable Hasso von Manteuffel, made more progress. 2 entire regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, approximately 9,000 men, were surrounded and captured on the Schnee-Eifel Plateau. It was the largest surrender of American troops since the fall of Bastogne in 1942. The German advance was creating a massive bulge in the Allied line, pushing westward into Belgium. It was this shape on the maps, this protrusion into Allied territory, that gave the battle its name. The Battle of the Bulge. Among the German units pushing west in the opening days of the offensive was a battle group that would become notorious for one of the worst atrocities committed against American soldiers in the entire European war. Kampfgruppe Peiper. It was named for its commander, SS Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper. Peiper was 29 years old, charismatic and ruthless. He had served on the Eastern Front, where the rules of warfare as understood in the West had long since dissolved. He commanded a powerful force of tanks and armored vehicles, the spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army's advance. His orders were to drive west as fast as possible, to ignore his flanks, to seize fuel depots before the Americans could destroy them, to reach the Meuse River within days. On December 17th, the second day of the offensive, Kampfgruppe Peiper captured approximately 150 American prisoners near the Belgian town of Malmedy. The prisoners were assembled in a field. Then the SS troops opened fire on them. 84 American soldiers were murdered in the Malmedy massacre. Some were shot as they stood. Others were shot as they ran. Some who fell wounded were shot again by SS soldiers who walked through the field, finishing off survivors. A few men escaped by playing dead and crawling away in the darkness. News of the massacre spread rapidly through the American forces. It did not break American morale. It hardened it. American soldiers who heard what had happened at Malmedy fought with a fury and a refusal to yield that the Germans had not anticipated. Kampfgruppe Peiper continued west, but fuel was running short. The roads were narrow and icy, and the tanks could only move slowly. American resistance stiffened. The fuel depots Peiper needed were either captured by other German units or destroyed by the Americans before he could reach them. By December 18th, Kampfgruppe Peiper was stalling. By Christmas, it was finished. Peiper abandoned his vehicles and led his surviving men back to German lines on foot through the snow. The spearhead of the 6th SS Panzer Army had failed. In the center of the Bulge sat a small Belgian town that neither side could afford to lose: Bastogne. 7 major roads converged on Bastogne. In the Ardennes, where movement was largely confined to roads because the forest and terrain made cross-country movement nearly impossible for vehicles, whoever held Bastogne controlled movement across a vast section of the battlefield. If the Germans took it, their advance westward would be dramatically accelerated. If the Americans held it, the entire German offensive would be channeled around it and slowed. Both sides understood this perfectly. The race for Bastogne began on December 17th, the second day of the offensive. The Americans won the race. Barely. The 101st Airborne Division, one of the most elite units in the American Army, was resting and refitting in Reims, France, after the brutal fighting of the Normandy and Market Garden campaigns. On the night of December 17th, they were ordered to move immediately to Bastogne. They had almost no winter equipment. Many men had no overcoats. Some had no gloves. They loaded onto trucks in the darkness and drove through the night toward the sound of the guns. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just ahead of the encircling German forces. Also arriving in Bastogne was Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st Airborne in the absence of its regular commander. McAuliffe was calm and direct, and possessed of exactly the kind of unshakable steadiness the situation required. By December 20th, Bastogne was surrounded. The Germans had cut every road into the town. The 101st Airborne and the other American units trapped with them, approximately 18,000 men in total, were completely encircled by German forces numbering perhaps 45,000. They had limited ammunition. They had almost no artillery shells. They had inadequate food and almost no medical supplies for the wounded who were filling the makeshift hospitals in the town's buildings. And they had almost no winter clothing in one of the coldest winters in European memory. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Celsius at night. Men dug foxholes in the frozen ground with whatever tools they had. Some used their helmets. They could not light fires for fear of revealing their positions to German artillery. They wrapped themselves in whatever they could find: curtains taken from farmhouses, burlap sacks, anything that provided warmth. Trench foot, a debilitating condition caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold and wet, became as dangerous as German bullets. Men lost toes and feet to frostbite. The wounded lay in cellars and barns without adequate morphine or bandages. But they held. On December 22nd, 4 German officers approached the American lines under a flag of truce. They carried a written demand for surrender, signed by the German commander. The demand was delivered to General McAuliffe. He read it. He thought for a moment, and then he wrote his reply. One word: nuts. The German officers were confused. An American officer explained to them that the word meant "go to hell." They returned to their lines. McAuliffe's reply was transmitted across the Allied world. It became one of the most famous responses in American military history. The surrounded, outnumbered, freezing defenders of Bastogne had been asked to surrender. They had said, "Nuts," and they kept fighting. While the men of the 101st Airborne were digging into the frozen ground around Bastogne, the Allied High Command was scrambling to respond to the crisis. On December 19th, General Eisenhower convened a conference at Verdun, a city whose name carried the weight of the worst battle of the First World War. His generals gathered around a map of the Bulge. The mood in the room could have been grim. The situation on paper was alarming. A massive German offensive had torn a hole in the Allied line. 2 American divisions had been shattered. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were dead or captured or missing. Bastogne was surrounded. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that captured something essential about his character. "The present situation is to be regarded as an opportunity for us, and not a disaster," he said. "There will be only cheerful faces at this conference table." He had a plan. The German offensive had pushed deep into Allied territory, but in doing so, it had extended and exposed its flanks. If the Allies could hold the shoulders of the Bulge in the north and south and then strike upward into the exposed southern flank of the German advance, they could cut off the entire German force that had pushed west. To do that, he needed someone to attack northward immediately. He looked at George Patton. General Patton commanded the Third Army to the south. His forces were currently oriented eastward, attacking toward Germany. To swing northward toward Bastogne, he would have to turn his entire army 90 degrees in the middle of winter, in the middle of a battle, and attack in a completely new direction. Eisenhower asked how long it would take. Patton said, 48 hours. The room went quiet. Turning an army of hundreds of thousands of men in 48 hours in winter conditions was logistically almost impossible. Most generals would have said a week at minimum. Patton had anticipated the question. Before the conference, he had quietly drawn up 3 separate plans for 3 different contingencies, one of which was exactly this. He had already given the order to begin the movement to his staff before he walked into the room. 48 hours, he said again. He kept his word. On December 22nd, just 2 days after the Verdun conference, and exactly when the German demand for Bastogne's surrender was being delivered to McAuliffe, Patton's Third Army began turning north. It was one of the most remarkable feats of military logistics in the entire war. Through the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge, the Allied air forces had been almost completely grounded. The weather over the Ardennes in December 1944 was some of the worst in memory. Thick cloud cover hung low over the forest. Fog filled the valleys. Visibility was near zero. The fighter bombers and medium bombers that had been devastating German columns throughout the autumn campaign could not fly. This was not an accident. Hitler had specifically chosen the timing of the offensive to coincide with a period of bad weather that Allied meteorologists had forecast. He knew that Allied air power was one of the most decisive advantages the enemy possessed. Ground that fog and cloud, and he neutralized it. For 8 days, the weather held. German columns moved during the day without fear of air attack. Fuel and ammunition flowed forward. The offensive maintained its momentum. And then, on December 23rd, the skies cleared. It happened almost overnight. The clouds broke. The fog dissolved. The temperature dropped even further, but the sky turned a brilliant winter blue, and the sun rose over the Ardennes for the first time in more than a week. Within hours, hundreds of Allied aircraft were in the air. C-47 transport aircraft flew over Bastogne and dropped supplies to the surrounded garrison. Ammunition, food, medical supplies, and desperately needed artillery shells floating down on parachutes into the snow-covered fields around the town. Fighter bombers swept over the German columns below. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings attacked German tanks and trucks and horse-drawn supply wagons that were exposed on the roads. German vehicles that had been moving freely for 8 days were suddenly being destroyed from the air. Columns backed up on the narrow forest roads. Bridges were hit. Fuel convoys were destroyed before they could reach the tanks that desperately needed them. The German offensive began to slow. Not stop, but slow. And slowing was enough, because Patton was coming. On December 26, 1944, 10 days after the German offensive had begun, and 6 days after Bastogne had been completely surrounded, a column of Sherman tanks from the 4th Armored Division of Patton's 3rd Army broke through the German lines south of the town. The lead tank commander radioed ahead to the American positions in Bastogne. "How are you doing in there?" he asked. "Renewing the garrison's supply and reinforcing it with fresh troops," he was told. Bastogne was relieved. The men of the 101st Airborne, who had held the town through 10 days of encirclement, constant attack, freezing temperatures, dwindling ammunition and food and medical supplies, who had said nuts to the German demand for surrender and meant it, those men would later be called the battered bastards of Bastogne. They had held. But the battle was far from over. The relief of Bastogne did not end the Battle of the Bulge. It marked the beginning of the long, brutal work of pushing the Germans back out of the territory they had seized. The bulge in the Allied line was still enormous. German forces still held vast areas of Belgian and Luxembourg territory. The fighting continued through January 1945 in conditions that became, if anything, even more brutal than the opening days of the offensive. The weather remained bitterly cold. Snow fell continuously. The roads were sheets of ice. Men fought in temperatures that froze the oil in tank engines and the water in canteens and the blood in wounds. Frostbite casualties were staggering. In some units, more men were lost to cold-related injuries than to enemy fire. The army had not anticipated the severity of the winter, and winter equipment was in desperately short supply. Men stuffed newspaper inside their boots for insulation. They slept huddled together for warmth. They built small fires only when they were certain no German observer could see the light. The Germans launched a major renewed assault on Bastogne on January 3, 1945. They threw fresh armored divisions at the town that had cost them so much already. The fighting was brutal and close. Tanks and infantry grappling in the streets of small Belgian villages, whose names most of the men fighting over them could barely pronounce. The Germans did not take Bastogne. Simultaneously, in the north, Field Marshal Montgomery's forces were pressing down on the northern shoulder of the Bulge. American and British forces were squeezing the German salient from both sides. Patton pushing north from the south, Montgomery pressing south from the north. The Bulge was being slowly compressed. On January 16, 1945, American forces advancing from the north and south linked up at the town of Houffalize in the center of the Bulge. The German salient had been cut in two. The remaining German forces were pulling back toward the German border. By January 25, 1945, the Allied lines had been restored to roughly where they had been on December 16th, the day the offensive began. The Battle of the Bulge was over. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering on both sides. American casualties were approximately 75,000, including 19,000 killed, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 captured or missing. It was the costliest battle in American military history. More Americans died in the Ardennes in those 6 weeks of winter fighting than in any other engagement the United States Army has ever fought. British casualties were approximately 1,400 killed and wounded. German casualties are harder to calculate precisely, but estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 killed, wounded, and captured. The losses in experienced men and irreplaceable equipment were catastrophic for a Germany that was already scraping the bottom of its manpower and industrial reserves. The tanks destroyed in the Bulge could not be replaced. The fuel expended in the offensive, the fuel that Hitler's generals had warned was insufficient, was gone. The experienced SS Panzer crews, who had been the cutting edge of the German armored force, were dead or captured in the snows of the Ardennes. Germany had gambled its last significant reserve of offensive strength in the west on a single throw of the dice, and lost. The failure of the Ardennes offensive accelerated the end of the war in Europe. In January 1945, the Soviet Union launched its massive winter offensive in the east, crossing the Vistula River and driving deep into Germany with an army of over 2 million men. With the reserves that had been committed to the Bulge gone, Germany had almost nothing left with which to resist. In the west, Patton's Third Army crossed the Moselle River and drove into Germany. American forces crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7, 1945, the first Allied crossing of the Great River since Napoleon. The bridge at Remagen had been scheduled for demolition by the Germans, but American troops captured it intact before the charges could be properly set. They poured across. From east and west, the Allied armies drove toward the heart of Germany. American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin on April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces fought street by street through the German capital. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. The war in Europe was over. The Battle of the Bulge was fought by ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances. They were young. Most of them were in their late teens or early 20s. They had grown up during the Depression. Many of them had never traveled more than 50 miles from their hometown before the war. Now they were in a frozen forest in Belgium, fighting for their lives in the coldest winter in decades. They were scared. Of course they were scared. Fear is not the absence of courage. It is what courage has to overcome. They were scared and cold and hungry and exhausted, and they fought anyway. The soldier in his foxhole in the frozen Ardennes did not think about grand strategy or the sweep of history. He thought about staying warm, about where the next artillery shell was going to land, about whether the man in the foxhole next to him was still breathing, about home. They came from every state in America, from farms in Iowa and factories in Pittsburgh and fishing boats in Maine and cotton fields in Georgia. They spoke with accents that made each other laugh when times were good enough for laughter. They had different religions and different backgrounds and different ideas about almost everything. But they held Bastogne. They held the shoulders of the Bulge. They turned and attacked in the worst winter conditions imaginable and pushed the Germans back through the same frozen forest the Germans had come through 6 weeks before. Private First Class, Staff Sergeant, Captain, Colonel. They did their jobs in conditions that would have broken lesser men, and they did not break. The men who fought in the Battle of the Bulge are almost all gone now. The youngest of them would be in their late 90s. Their voices are fading from the world. But the forest is still there. The Ardennes is still there, green and quiet in summer, white and still in winter. If you walk in those woods today, you can sometimes find the ghost of a foxhole, a slight depression in the ground, an irregularity in the forest floor that tells you someone dug here once. Someone lay here in the frozen dark and waited for morning. Their names are on memorials in small Belgian towns, on headstones in military cemeteries, where the white markers stand in long, straight rows across carefully tended grass. At the Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery, where General Patton himself is buried among the men he led, his own request to be buried with his soldiers. They are not forgotten. Let the story of the Battle of the Bulge settle quietly around you now. The frozen forest, the snow deep across the Ardennes, the sound of artillery in the darkness, and then silence. The men in their foxholes pulling their coats tighter against the cold. The defenders of Bastogne looking up at the supply parachutes drifting down through the winter sky. The tanks of Patton's army grinding north through the ice and snow toward the surrounded town. The one-word reply to a demand for surrender. Nuts. And then, slowly, painfully, at enormous cost, the pushing back, the compression of the bulge, the restoration of the line, the beginning of the end. The white crosses in the Belgian snow. You are warm and safe and still. The story has been told. Let sleep come now. Good night.